If you served with the British Army of the Rhine, you knew the Chieftain, the low grey shape dug into a German hillside, the smell of diesel on a cold morning, and the long nights in the workshop with the engine pack hauled out on a crane. It carried the finest tank gun in the world, a 120mm weapon that could kill at 2,000 meters. Armies across the Middle East queued to buy it. It stood watch against the largest army on Earth for the best part of 30 years. And then the works that built it fell silent. The last British tank rolled off the line, and the country that armed half the world stopped building tanks altogether. How does a nation that built the best tank of the Cold War simply stop? What happened behind those factory gates? Chapter 1. The fuel that was never there. The story doesn't begin in a factory. It begins with a fear. In the middle years of the Cold War, the planners of the Western Alliance looked east across the flat farmland of northern Germany and did their arithmetic. If the Soviet Union ever sent its tank divisions west, the war would be fast, enormous, and possibly nuclear. Refineries would burn, pipelines would be cut, fuel depots would be among the first things to go, and an army that couldn't fuel its tanks was no army at all. So the Alliance reached for a tidy solution to a terrifying problem. In 1957, NATO adopted a policy requiring its armoured fighting vehicles to be capable of running on more than one fuel. Petrol, diesel, kerosene, whatever was to hand on a battlefield where nothing could be relied upon. One fuel through the pipeline. One fuel in every vehicle. No misfueling in the chaos. No tank left dry because the wrong lorry arrived. On paper, it was elegant. It was the kind of idea that sounds like common sense in a conference room and turns into a decade of misery in a workshop. Richard Ogorkiewicz understood engines the way few men of his time did. He was the great chronicler of the armoured vehicle, a writer whose technical descriptions were read on both sides of the Atlantic. And it was Ogorkiewicz who recorded what Britain's next tank had originally been meant to carry. Not the strange machine it would end up with. Something conventional. Something that worked. Britain had been thinking about a successor to the Centurion since 1950. The War Office ran what it called concept research studies, and they ranged from the sensible to the outlandish. Evolutionary developments of the Centurion at one end, radical 1- and 2-man tanks armed with missiles or liquid propellant guns at the other. By 1954, the direction had settled. The next British tank would be an evolutionary design carrying a very high-velocity gun. It would be low, hard-hitting, and heavily protected, and it would need an engine. That was where the trouble started, quietly, years before anyone on a factory floor felt it. The demand for a fuel that would be there, whatever happened, had been born from a fear of a fuel that might not be there at all. In chasing the answer to that fear, Britain would build an engine that was, in a sense, always fighting the wrong war. Chapter 2. The engine they didn't set out to build. The first plan was good. That is the part that aches. The original intention, as Ogorkiewicz set it down in an American armour journal in the spring of 1961, was for a water-cooled V8 of some 1,460 cubic inches, a four-stroke associated with Rolls-Royce, and developed through the government's own establishment at Chertsey, the Fighting Vehicles Research and Development Establishment, known to everyone in the trade simply as FVRDE. It could be built in a petrol-burning form or a diesel-burning form. It was the sort of engine a great motor engineering nation knew how to make. Rolls-Royce had powered the Centurion with the Meteor, a 27-litre petrol V12 descended from the Merlin that had carried Spitfires through the Battle of Britain. Britain knew how to build a tank engine. It had been doing it for a generation. Years later, hauled before the Committee of Public Accounts to explain what had gone wrong, General Sir John Gibbon laid out the sequence with the flat precision of a man who had watched it happen. 2 design studies had been placed in the mid-1950s, he said, one with Rover, one with Leyland. Both approaches failed, and by the time the failures were understood, the calendar had run on, the shape of the tank's hull was hardening into steel, and a decision had to be made. The decision was the one NATO's policy pointed toward. Set aside the conventional 4-stroke. Build a multi-fuel engine instead. That was the moment the trouble stopped being theoretical. A multi-fuel engine, in the understanding of the day, meant an opposed piston 2-stroke, a configuration that could be persuaded to run on fuels of wildly different character by varying, in principle, the phasing of its 2 crankshafts and so the compression inside it. Leyland Motors, under the direction of FVRDE at Chertsey, was asked to develop one. The reference points were engines Napier and Tilling-Stevens had already built, and one of those, the TS3, was, in the words of the men who assessed it, particularly highly regarded. So a firm best known for buses and lorries was handed one of the most demanding engineering problems in the country. Build a compact, powerful, endlessly adaptable heart for the tank that would stand between Western Europe and the Red Army, and build it fast, because the hull was already taking shape around the hole where it would sit. Design of the tank, designated FV4201, began in 1958. By then, as Gibbon put it, the shape of the Chieftain was becoming fairly firm. The engine and the tank were now committed to each other, for better or worse, before anyone knew which it would be. Chapter 3. A bloodline of opposed pistons. To understand what Leyland built, you have to understand what an opposed piston engine actually is, because it is one of the strangest good ideas in the history of the internal combustion engine. In an ordinary engine, a piston moves up a cylinder toward a fixed cylinder head, compresses the fuel and air trapped above it, and is driven back down when that mixture fires. Valves at the top let the gases in and out. The head seals everything shut. It is the arrangement in nearly every car ever made. The opposed piston engine throws away the head entirely. In each cylinder, it puts two pistons facing each other, moving toward each other. The fuel burns in the space between them, and the force of the burn drives them apart, each connected to its own crankshaft. There is no cylinder head. There are no valves. The pistons themselves uncover ports cut into the walls of the cylinder as they travel, letting exhaust out one end and fresh air in the other. It is lighter, lower, and simpler in its parts count than a conventional engine of the same power, and it is very, very hard to keep cool. The idea was not new. It reached back to the German Junkers aero-diesels of the 1930s, the Jumo engines that had flown reconnaissance aircraft high over Europe, and Napier had licensed that principle for British use. The single crankshaft variant that most directly fathered the tank engine came from a lorry, the TS3, developed from around 1945 by a small team at Humber's Stoke-Aldermore plant in Coventry. The chief engineer was a man named Eric Coy, and the work was set in motion by Roots' engineering director, Bernard Winter, who had seen that the new cab-forward lorries needed an engine flat enough to tuck beneath the driver's seat. Drivers called the TS3 the knocker for the hard, distinctive bark it made. Men who heard it never forgot it. From that bloodline came the L60. It was a 19-litre engine, 6 cylinders, 12 pistons, 2 crankshafts geared together, a Roots blower forcing air through it to sweep out the burnt gases. Vertical, compact, dry-sumped, water-cooled, with a compression ratio of 16:1. Rolls-Royce, by then the parent of Napier, lent technical assistance. The complete engine first ran in 1959, and the promise it carried was seductive. From 19 litres, it was expected to match the 600 horsepower of the Meteor's 27 in far less space, leaving the hull low and the silhouette small. A low tank is a hard tank to hit. Everything about the Chieftain's shape flowed from the desire to sit low in the ground, and the engine was supposed to make that possible. There was only one difficulty, and it was buried deep in the physics. To burn all those different fuels cleanly, the engine needed higher internal temperatures than usual. Heat was not a side effect of the L60. Heat was the whole point of it. And an engine designed to run hot, fitted into a space designed to be small, in a tank that would only ever get heavier, was carrying the seed of its own trouble from the first day it turned over. Chapter 4. The tank they built. Around it. Set the engine aside for a moment, as its designers could not, and look at the tank taking shape around it. Because whatever the L60 would become, the Chieftain itself was a genuine marvel, and the men who built it were among the best in the world at what they did. Start with the gun. At the Royal Armament Research and Development Establishment at Fort Halstead in Kent, engineers designed in 1957 the weapon that would define the Chieftain and much of NATO after it, the Royal Ordnance L11, a rifled gun of 120mm. It was the first of the Alliance's 120mm tank guns and became the standard others followed. In time, more than 3,000 of them would be built. It fired its shell and its propellant charge separately, The charge held not in a brass case, but in a bag of combustible cloth. A bagged charge system chosen after an earlier attempt at a liquid propellant gun collapsed because the pump needed to inject the liquid was simply too big to fit inside any tank. That bagged charge created a danger, and the answer to it was one of the quietly brilliant features of the design. The charges were stored low in the hull, in 36 recesses surrounded by a jacket of pressurized water and glycol. If an enemy round punched through the armor, it would rupture the jacket first, and the escaping liquid would soak the charges before they could ignite. Wet stowage, they called it. It was designed to prevent the thing every tank crew feared above all others: the brew-up, the catastrophic internal fire that turned a tank into a furnace with men still inside. In gunnery trials in July of 1962, the Chieftain's fire control achieved a first-round hit, probability of 81% against a target at 2,000 meters with armor-piercing shot. For its day, that was extraordinary. The armor that protected the crew ran up to 195 millimeters thick, and because it was so steeply angled, a shell striking the glacis had to travel through the equivalent of nearly 390 millimeters of steel to reach the men behind it. To let the tank sit so low, the designers did something no one had done before in a British tank. They laid the driver down. In the Chieftain, the driver reclined almost flat on his back when the tank was closed for battle, peering out through a periscope, which let the whole front of the hull be built lower and more sharply sloped. The idea had been trialled years earlier on a curious testbed, the FV-4202, a modified Centurion, some 40 tons, that also tried out the gun mounting without a heavy external mantlet. Behind the fighting compartment sat the L60, and behind the L60 sat the gearbox, and the gearbox too came from a distinguished line. It used a steering system devised back in 1935 by H.E. Merritt, then the director of tank design at Woolwich Arsenal, and it was built by the firm of David Brown. The same David Brown whose name would one day sit on the boot of an Aston Martin. The whole engine and transmission were designed as a single removable pack, so that a broken unit could be lifted out and a fresh one dropped in. That decision, made for reasons of maintenance, would later become the one thing standing between the Chieftain and complete humiliation. But that comes later. The tank was assembled at the Royal Ordnance Factory at Leeds, at Barnbow, and at Vickers on Tyneside at Elswick, plants staffed by engineering families who had been building fighting vehicles since the last war and the one before it. The first prototype was completed in 1959. Troop trials went well by early 1964. 2 production lines were set up, and late in 1966, the Chieftain was adopted for service. The first vehicles issued in the opening weeks of 1967 to the 11th Hussars at Hohne in West Germany. The men who received it could hardly believe their luck. They had the best gun in the world, the best armor in the world, in a tank that sat so low and hit so hard it seemed to belong to a later decade. Everything above the engine deck was a triumph. That was the tragedy waiting to unfold. That everything above the engine deck was a triumph, and everything below it was a promise not yet kept. Chapter 5. The Best in the World. For a few golden years, when the packs held together and the diesel flowed, the Chieftain was exactly what its builders had dreamed it would be. Picture the North German plain in the late 1960s, the great flat corridor of farmland and forest, and small towns through which everyone knew the Soviet armies would come, if they came at all. This was where the British Army of the Rhine stood its watch, and this was where the Chieftain took its place, with the 1st, 3rd and 4th Armoured Divisions, dug into hull-down firing positions along the ground the Alliance would have to hold. A tank in a hull-down position shows the enemy only its turret, the rest of it tucked behind a fold in the earth, and the Chieftain, low and long-gunned, was built for precisely that fight. It could crouch in the landscape, present almost nothing, and reach out 2,000 meters to kill. The crews learned to love the gun above all. Men who trained on the ranges at the British Army Training Unit in Suffield, out on the Canadian Prairie in Alberta, told stories that would sound like boasting if the records didn't back them, of putting a sabot round into a target at 3,000 meters, farther than most tanks of the era could reliably see, let alone hit. The fire control let a good gunner and a good commander work as one, and a well-drilled Chieftain crew could ruin an enemy's day before the enemy knew the Chieftain was there. Colonel Peter Hammer of the 11th Hussars, the regiment that first took the tank into service, put the machine's strange character into a single sentence that crews repeated for years. "Over really bad broken ground," he said, The Chieftain could leave a Leopard for dead. The German Leopard was lighter and faster on a smooth road, but where the going was foul, where a tank had to claw across mud and ruts and rubble, the Chieftain's brute strength told. It was a tank you could believe in if you only judged it from the turret ring up, and the world wanted it. This is the part of the story that later generations forget, that the Chieftain was, for a time, a genuine export triumph, a symbol of British engineering that foreign armies paid handsomely to own. The greatest customer of all was Iran, under the Shah. On the recommendation of an Israeli general, Israel Tal, one of the finest armoured commanders of his generation, the man who would go on to father Israel's own Merkava, the Imperial Iranian army bought the Chieftain in enormous numbers, 707 gun tanks of the Mark III and Mark V export patterns, and beyond them a further tranche of a more advanced variant, along with armoured recovery vehicles and bridge layers. Kuwait bought it. Oman took delivery of a small number in the early 1980s. Jordan received nearly 300 of a version called the Khalid. British steel, British guns, going out to the deserts of the Middle East, in numbers that kept the lines at Leeds busy and confident. Not everyone was persuaded. No other NATO country ever adopted the Chieftain. Most chose the Leopard instead. Faster and, though few would say it aloud, more reliable. An agreement to sell the tank to Israel and build it jointly was cancelled by the British government in 1969. And yet even that cancellation carried a strange compliment, because the Israeli experience of the Chieftain fed directly into the design of the Merkava that Tal would build for his own country. Wherever the Chieftain went, it left an impression. The gun and the armour saw to that. Around the two great assembly plants, whole communities lived by the tank. Barnbow at Leeds had been turning out fighting vehicles for decades, centurions before the Chieftain, and one day challengers after it, more than 4,000 tanks across its working life. These were skilled trades passed from father to son, the fitters and welders and machinists of a Yorkshire engineering town whose pay packets and pride were bound up in the machines rolling out of the gate. The men who built the Chieftain believed, with good reason, that they were building the best tank in the world. Judged by the gun and the armour, they were. There was only one thing wrong. It sat behind the crew's backs, breathing hot, and it had never once, from its very first day in service, delivered the power it had been promised to make. Chapter 6. The Summit. Every story like this one has a summit, the highest point from which, had anyone been standing on it and able to see clearly, the whole descent would already have been visible. For the Chieftain, the summit was the turn of the 1970s. The tank was in full service with the British Army of the Rhine. The gun was the envy of the alliance. The export orders were flowing, and the greatest of them all was still to come, for on the first day of 1974, Iran would sign a contract for more than 1,200 tanks and pay for it in full. In advance, a sum that left the Ministry of Defence certain of Leeds' future for decades. From the outside, in those years, British armoured engineering looked like a going concern with a bright horizon. The best tank in the world, and the world queuing to buy it. But stand on that summit and listen, and the sound is wrong. The L60 had entered production making 585 horsepower, not the 600 it had been designed to make, and nowhere near what a tank growing steadily heavier would come to need. The Chieftain had been intended to weigh something like 47 tons. In service, it kept putting on weight, edging toward 55 tons as more armour and more equipment were bolted on, and an engine already short of breath was asked to haul more and more. Of the three British main battle tanks of the Cold War, the Chieftain was the slowest. The engine that was supposed to give it a small silhouette and a big heart had given it the small silhouette and left the heart wanting. The men in the turret could feel it. The tank that could leave a leopard for dead over broken ground was the same tank that laboured up gradients, that ran hot, that a driver learned to nurse. And in the workshops of the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, the REM, the men whose job was to keep the fleet running, the reports were already accumulating. Liners that didn't seal, fan drives under strain, oil where oil should not be. The removable pack, designed as a convenience, was quietly becoming a necessity, because packs were coming out far more often than anyone had planned for. None of this had yet broken into public scandal. The export orders still flowed. The confidence at Leeds was real. But the gap between what the tank was and what its engine could sustain had been present from the first prototype, and it was widening. The doctrine had demanded an engine that could drink any fuel. The engineers had built one, and now, at the very summit of the Chieftain's reputation, the bill for that demand was quietly coming due. Not yet as catastrophe, but as a low, persistent unease, felt first by the men who had to fix the thing, long before it reached the men who had ordered it built. The descent from that summit is where the true story lies. Chapter 7. The trouble behind the crew. The failures were not mysterious. That is what made them so hard to forgive. They were specific, they were repeated, and the men who lived with them could name everyone. Start with the cylinder liners. In each cylinder of the L60 sat a liner, a sleeve within which the two pistons ran, and that liner had to be sealed against the water jacket that cooled it. On the L60, that seal was a persistent source of trouble. It failed. Coolant leaked past it into the bore, into the very space where the fuel was meant to burn, and when a crew fired up an engine that had been weeping overnight, the trapped water flashed to steam and blew out of the exhaust as a great cloud of white smoke. On a training ground, it was an embarrassment. On the North German plain, in a war, it was a death sentence, because a cloud of white smoke rising off a hull-down tank told every enemy gunner within sight exactly where to aim. The one virtue the Chieftain had bought with its low silhouette, its ability to hide, was undone by an engine that announced itself to the whole battlefield the moment it woke. Then the fan drives. The engine's cooling fans were turned by belts, and those belts overstressed the housings that carried the fan bearings, deep in the crankcase, until the housings cracked. Crews and rem fitters, watching this happen again and again, worked out a grim field expedient. They drilled holes in the belts, deliberately weakening them so the belts would snap first, sacrificing the cheap, replaceable part to save the expensive, irreplaceable one buried inside the engine. It was the kind of improvisation that keeps an army moving and quietly damns the machine that requires it. And the trouble did not stop at the engine. Behind it sat the Merritt Brown gearbox, and when that fine old transmission was mated to the L60, it began to overheat, because it had been designed for a lighter, less powerful vehicle than the Chieftain kept becoming. The cure was more oil flow and a heat exchanger, and the redesigned gearbox came out bigger than the old one. So much bigger that the engineers could no longer fit the exhaust silencers inside the engine bay where they belonged, and had to move them out into an armoured box bolted to the rear of the hull. One flawed heart, and the floor rippled outward through everything it touched. Then the oil itself. The L60 leaked oil from vibration and from pipework that had been badly routed, and it leaked persistently. There is a comparative trial that tells this part of the story better than any statistic could. Between the middle of January and late March of 1968, the Royal Netherlands Army tested a single Chieftain, British registration 03 Echo Bravo 81, against a German Leopard, week after week, one machine against the other. The Dutch preferred the Leopard, and much of the reason was the Chieftain's build quality. Its engine leaked so much oil, the reports recorded, that the engine compartment had turned black. A brand new tank from the finest gun and armour tradition in the world, and inside its engine bay the metal was already slick and dark with oil that had escaped where it should have stayed. There is a figure that would later travel across the internet and attach itself to this story, a claim that 90% of the early tanks broke down. It should be handled with care, and honesty demands it be handled with care here. That number traces back to a single uncited sentence, copied from page to page until repetition lent it the appearance of fact. The truthful picture is harder edged and better documented than any tidy percentage. The Dutch trial and its blackened engine bay. The liner seals a service history frankly called a persistent source of trouble. The fan housings that cracked. The pack that came out again and again and again. The precise percentage matters less than the pattern, and the pattern is not in dispute. Behind all of it stood a spares problem that made everything worse. When the L60 first went into service, production of the engine had been earmarked for the new tanks still coming off the assembly lines. There was no adequate stock of spare parts, and no proper float of spare engines to draw upon. So, when a pack failed in Germany, the men who needed a replacement often found there simply wasn't one to be had. The engine was unreliable, and the system built around it had no cushion to absorb that unreliability. The two failures fed each other, and the crews paid for both. Chapter 8. The Company That Could Not Hold. An engine is not built in isolation. It is built by a company, supported by a company, kept alive year after year by a company. And in the very years the L60 most needed steady, patient, well-funded attention, the company that made it was being swallowed by one of the worst industrial collapses in modern British history. In January of 1968, Leyland Motors merged with British Motor Holdings to form the British Leyland Motor Corporation. It was a marriage encouraged from within government, by Tony Benn among others, in the hope of forging a national champion in motor manufacturing that could stand against the Germans and the Japanese. What it forged instead was a sprawling, ungovernable giant, something like 74 plants, model ranges that overlapped and cannibalized one another, and industrial relations so poisoned that the corporation became, in the standard verdict of the historians, an unmanageable and financially crippled behemoth. By December of 1974, British Leyland needed a government guarantee simply to survive the month. The Ryder Report, delivered to the Cabinet in the spring of 1975, led to effective nationalisation under an Act of Parliament that year, with a state board managing the government's majority stake. In 1977, Michael Edwards was brought in as chairman and began cutting the corporation apart to save whatever could be saved. This was the backdrop against which the L60's troubles were meant to be solved. Consider what that meant in practice. Somewhere in Germany, a tank crew sits in a field with a dead engine and no replacement to hand, and the parent company of the firm responsible for that engine is fighting for its own survival, tearing itself into pieces, its boardroom consumed by strikes and losses, and the daily struggle not to go under entirely. An engine that needed a decade of unglamorous, meticulous development work was the product of a company that could barely hold itself together from one quarter to the next. The men in the turret could not have known the chaos in the boardroom behind their broken pack, but they lived downstream of it, every single time they waited for a part that never came. And behind the corporate chaos lay the original decision, the one at the very heart of the tragedy, and, like most such decisions, made by reasonable men for entirely reasonable reasons. By the early 1960s, the engine was not ready. The prototypes were down on power. The thermal problems were understood, at least in outline. A patient nation in a patient age might have held the tank back until the engine caught up. Britain did not. In 1963, the decision was taken to put the Chieftain into production, engine troubles and all. General Sir John Gibbon, hauled years later before Parliament to defend that choice, did not hide behind evasion. The British Army needed a new tank, he said, and needed it as quickly as was reasonably possible. And that was true. The Centurion was aging. The Soviet armies across the plain were not waiting. A real tank with a flawed engine was worth more in the cold arithmetic of the Cold War than a perfect tank that arrived too late to matter. It was a defensible decision. It may even have been the right one, but it committed the British Army to a decade of nursing an engine sent to war before it was finished. One member of Parliament, surveying the whole saga, remarked that a development record like this one would have failed Marlborough and Wellington, would have lost Britain's greatest soldiers, their greatest victories. 17 years passed between the NATO policy that demanded the engine and the point at which it could finally be trusted. A child born the year that policy was written would have been most of the way to adulthood, before the engine it produced could reliably carry a tank across Germany and back again. Chapter 9. The Long War Against the Engine. The fixes came in waves, and the men who ran them gave them names out of the American Western, the code names chosen, it is said, by someone with a fondness for the genre. There was Fleetfoot, the first great development program. There was High Noon. There was Dark Morn, and there was Sundance, the one that finally, very nearly, got there. The work was relentless and unglamorous, the exact opposite of the boardroom drama that had produced the need for it. New pistons, a 3-lobe blower to replace the old one, redesigned liners, fitted so tightly they held their own seal, new injectors, new fuel filters, new fan drive belts of a different pattern, and a sealant called Belzona, worked into the liner seals in the late 1970s that finally cured the leaks which had blackened that Dutch engine bay a decade earlier. Each modification hunted down one specific failure, and slowly, across mark after mark, the power climbed while the failures thinned. 585 horsepower at the start, 650, 720 by the culmination of Fleetfoot, 750 by the end, and by December of 1978, a target engine life of 4,000 miles, Modest by the standard of a family motor car, hard won for a tank engine battered by constant changes of speed and load, had at last been achieved. Running alongside the engine work was a broader program called Totem Pole, which through the second half of the 1970s brought all of Britain's chieftains up to a single common standard, fitting the more powerful engine along with an improved fire control system and modern radios. Piece by piece, the tank the army had been sold in 1967 was a decade late, finally being delivered. Parliament by now wanted answers. The Chieftain's engine came before the Committee of Public Accounts, the very setting for Gibbon's testimony, and it became the subject of a dedicated inquiry by the House of Commons Expenditure Committee, whose report, plainly titled The Chieftain Tank Engine, was published by the Stationery Office in the summer of 1978. The defence ministers of those years, Fred Mulley, who presented the defence estimates, John Gilbert, James Wellbeloved, had inherited a problem written into alliance policy 2 decades before, and now, at last, being dragged into daylight and made to account for itself. Lieutenant Colonel Dick Taylor, a Royal Tank Regiment officer who had commanded the Chieftain and later wrote the definitive workshop manual on it, set down the fairest verdict anyone has managed on the L60. Reliability improved over the life of the tank, he wrote, and it improved for 2 reasons: a long series of modifications and the skill of the remmer and the crews in doing the right preventive maintenance. And then he named the deeper truth of the thing. Like so many poor tank engines, it had not been a dedicated design at all, but an adapted commercial engine, a lorry engine, in its bones, and it was never well suited to the battering it took as a tank power plant, the constant changing of revolutions, the trouble with air filtration, the poor internal flow of oil. It had been born to sit beneath the cab of a comma lorry. It was asked to go to war, and it never entirely forgave anyone for the difference. Chapter 10. Sitting Ducks and the Sea of Mud. Set aside the marks and the horsepower figures and the parliamentary reports, and go back to the men in the field, because behind every failed liner seal and every cracked fan housing was a crew, in a field in Germany, sitting still. They kept the memory sharp for the rest of their lives. One tanker recalled at least 3 packs running away and blowing, the engine racing out of all control until it destroyed itself, and having to abandon a tank with no engine at all, because there were no spares left anywhere in Germany. If only the Russians had known, he wrote. It was a joke, and it was not a joke. The scenario the British Army of the Rhine trained for, day after day, was a Soviet armoured assault across the plain, and in that scenario, the arithmetic was merciless. Each of the roughly 500 British tank crews was reckoned to have perhaps a week to live, and in that week was expected to destroy 7 or 8 enemy vehicles before dying. That calculation assumed the tank was moving, fighting, hiding, killing. A tank that had thrown a pack and sat dead in a field did none of those things. It killed nothing. It hid from no one. It simply waited to be hit. The black humour of the workshops caught the whole tragedy in a single sentence. It was said, sarcastically, that the Chieftain was extremely effective, provided it broke down in a useful location. A tank that could not be relied upon to reach the battle was, whatever the brilliance of its gun, a pillbox with tracks. The finest 120mm gun in the world is worth precisely nothing if it cannot be driven to the place where the enemy is. There was one thing, and only one thing, that stood between the L60 and total disgrace: the removable pack. Because the whole engine and gearbox lifted out as a single unit, a purpose-built recovery vehicle called the FV434, fitted with its own crane, could hoist a dead pack out and drop a fresh one in within something like an hour and a half to 2 hours, against the 12 hours it took to change a Centurion's engine. The philosophy behind it had a cold, honest logic, all its own. A British Army study had concluded that a future tank battle would last no more than 2 hours, so a battle-worn engine could simply be swapped out afterward and mended later, at leisure, in a proper workshop. The design admitted, in its very architecture, that the engine would fail, and set out to make failing survivable. The plain judgment of the record is that the reliability problem would have been far worse without that removable pack, which usually got a stranded tank running again within a couple of hours of breaking down. It was a brilliant answer to a problem that should never have needed answering. Between them, the clever pack, the tireless fitters, the crews who learned to nurse the thing, the British somehow kept the fleet alive through the years when the engine itself would not cooperate. By the end of the 1970s, after the 5 phases of Sundance, availability had climbed to something like 80%. It had taken nearly a decade past the tank's entry into service to reach a figure a modern army would consider merely acceptable. The men had won their long war against the engine, but they had won it years too late to spare the Chieftain its reputation, and they had won it just in time for a different army, in a different climate, to discover how much the engine still cost when nobody was there to nurse it. Because the Chieftain's hardest test never came on the North German plain it had been built for. It came in the deserts and marshes of the Iran-Iraq War. When the Shah fell in 1979, the Great Iranian Order was cancelled, but Iran already had hundreds of chieftains in service, and in September of 1980 it went to war with Iraq. The verdict of that war on the L60 was harsh. The chronic engine troubles and the tank's poor power-to-weight ratio made the chieftains unreliable and slow across hard ground, prone to breaking down in the middle of a battle or presenting a sluggish, labouring target to a faster enemy. The worst of it came early, in the first days of January in 1981, in the operation the Iranians called Nasser, the biggest tank battle of the entire war. 3 armoured divisions pushed forward from Dezful toward Susangerd, the chieftains of the 92nd among them, and they punched through the Iraqi lines. But they raced ahead with their flanks unguarded and no infantry to support them, and the Iraqis, who had spotted the advance from the air, closed a 3-sided box around them. For 4 days the two forces fought in a sea of mud. When the chieftains tried to manoeuvre, they bogged down in the marsh. Others simply ran dry of fuel or ammunition and were abandoned where they stood. When it was over, the Iraqis had lost perhaps 45 tanks. The Iranians had lost somewhere between 100 and 200, and 141 men were dead. An Iraqi Republican Guard general would later marvel that a single brigade had, in the space of a day, destroyed the better part of a division, a thing that was not supposed to be possible. The battle had been ordered by Iran's president, Abul Hassan Banisadr, who had gambled that a great victory might shore up his crumbling political standing. The gamble failed catastrophically, and within months the failure had helped drive him from office and out of the country in disguise. That was the strategic cost. The human cost sat rusting in the marsh. Chieftains stuck to their hulls in the mud, the finest gun in the world pointing at nothing. By the war's end, of the 894 chieftains Iran had started with, only 200 were left. The rest were destroyed, broken beyond recovery, or captured, and Iraq took so many that it passed some along to Jordan. Nearly 700 tanks gone, and yet, because this story refuses to be simple, the gun was still the gun. Even in that war, the chieftain's fire control and its great rifled weapon were feared. Iranian chieftains could destroy the older Soviet tanks with confidence and remained a genuine threat even to the modern T-72, helped by Iranian gunnery that was by many accounts the better of the two sides. When the chieftain reached the fight, it fought well. The tragedy, as it had always been, was in the reaching. Chapter 11. The Silent Works. There is a way to know, beyond any argument, what a nation truly thinks of an engine. You look at what it chooses to build next, and when Britain built the chieftain's successor, it delivered its verdict on the whole multi-fuel dream in the plainest possible terms. It threw the idea away. The Challenger 1 entered British service in 1983, and in place of the opposed piston, multi-fuel, 2-stroke L60, the strange machine a NATO policy had forced into being, the Challenger carried a Rolls-Royce engine called the Condor CV-12. It was everything the L60 was not: a conventional 4-stroke, a 26-litre turbocharged V12 diesel, 1,200 horsepower, reliable from the start. It was, in its essentials, exactly the kind of engine, a conventional Rolls-Royce diesel, that had been set aside in the late 1950s when the multi-fuel policy killed the original V8. A quarter of a century and an ocean of misery later, Britain had circled almost exactly back to where it began, and chosen the sound engine it should have been permitted to build all along. And in time, NATO itself rescinded the multi-fuel requirement, the very demand that had started the whole sorry business. The impossible feat the L60 had been born to perform was, in the end, quietly declared no longer necessary. The contrast in the field was stark, and it was measured. During the Gulf War of 1991, the Challenger 1 achieved an availability of some 98% across the whole campaign, its recovery variant reaching 100, both averaging around 100 kilometers a day for weeks on end. That was what a conventional diesel gave you. A tank that started and ran and fought and kept on running. It was the ordinary reliability the L60 had never once been able to promise from the day it first turned over. But history keeps one last quiet irony in reserve. In that same Gulf campaign, certain mature Chieftain-based support vehicles, recovery and engineer machines still running the fully developed L60, reportedly matched or even bettered the Challenger's availability. By 1991, after 30 years of modification, the L60 had finally become a decent engine. It had got there in the end. It had simply taken so long and cost so much and arrived so late that by the time it worked as it should, the tank it was built for was already being retired and the concept it embodied had already been abandoned. The men who had spent their careers fixing it were proved right on every count. It could be made to work. It just could never be made to work the way it was promised, in the time it was given, for the reason it was built. And so, at the last, follow the story home, to the place that built the tank, and to the silence that finally fell there. The Royal Ordnance Factory at Leeds, at Barnbow, had been a place of national labour since before living memory. In the First World War, it had been the greatest shell-filling factory in Britain, a city within a city, staffed at its height by some 16,000 workers, better than 9 in every 10 of them women, the Barnbow lasses, drawn in from Leeds and Castleford and Harrogate and the villages beyond, working 3 shifts around the clock. It was dangerous work. On a December night in 1916, an explosion tore through one of the filling rooms and killed 35 of those women outright. Their names are gathered now on memorials near the old site and among the 1,600 women commemorated in the Five Sisters window at York Minster. This was ground that had already given a great deal before it ever built a single tank. After the wars, it built Centurions, then Chieftains, then Challengers, better than 4,000 tanks across its working life, the trade handed down through Yorkshire engineering families from father to son. When the Iranian order was cancelled in 1979, an order worth well over £1,000 million, meant to keep Leeds busy for years, it landed as a body blow and helped cost some 1,300 jobs across the Royal Ordnance factories. Then the slower unravelling. In 1986, the government decided to sell the Leeds tank factory to its rival, Vickers, and the debate reached the floor of the House of Commons. The government itself admitted that Barnbow was the best heavy tank factory in Britain, and Vickers acknowledged that its workforce was the finest tank-building force in the country. And yet it was being sold off, and redundancies that autumn were made inevitable, the reason given being that there was no longer room for 2 tank factories in the country. One worker at Barnbow, hearing all this, wrote to his Member of Parliament with a question no minister ever really answered. If there was no room for 2 tank factories in the country, how on earth could there be room for 2 inside the same company? The best factory, the best workforce, and no future. The men on the floor could see the contradiction plainly, even when Westminster could not. The tank line at Leeds fell quiet by the turn of the century. Vickers became Alvis Vickers, and Alvis Vickers was absorbed into a still larger defence company, and in the years that followed, the buildings that had built 4,000 tanks were pulled down, and the ground was cleared. There is a housing estate on that land now. They named it Centurion Fields, new homes rising where the proving ground once ran, where whole men had watched the tanks climb the test ramps, where the Barnbow lasses had given their lives 100 years before. The last Challenger tank left a British production line in the spring of 2002, and Britain has not built a new tank since. The gun-making skill on Tyneside was lost soon after. A nation that had armoured itself and half its allies, that had sent its tanks to the deserts of the Middle East and stood them along the plains of Germany against the largest army on earth, builds no tanks at all today. You cannot lay all of that at the door of one engine. Trade and politics and the end of the Cold War closed Barnbow, not the L60. But the L60 is where the strain first showed. It is where a great engineering tradition was handed an impossible task and very nearly broke itself trying to honour it, where the quiet confidence that had built the best tank in the world first began to leak away, like oil from pipework that had been badly routed, into a compartment slowly turning black. There is a phrase the old crews and the enthusiasts use, and it holds the whole story in 6 words. Shite engine, brilliant turret. That was the Chieftain. the most powerful gun in the world at its birth, armor that could turn aside nearly anything the age could throw at it, a silhouette so low it could sink into a fold of German farmland and reach out to kill at 2,000 meters, and behind the crew, breathing hot, an engine that had been asked to do the impossible and spent 17 years not quite managing it, cracking its liners, snapping its fan drives, blackening its own bay with leaking oil, and betraying its tank's hidden position with a plume of white smoke on a cold morning. The tragedy of the L60 was never really a tragedy of engineering. The men who designed it were good. The men who built it in Leeds and Coventry were good. The men who fixed it, year after thankless year in the workshops of Germany, were among the finest in the world at what they did. And, in the end, they won. They made the engine work. The tragedy was only that the demand came first and the engineering came second. Frightened planners, staring east at a war they prayed would never come, asked for an engine that could drink any fuel in the ruins of a poisoned battlefield. It was a reasonable fear. It produced an unreasonable requirement, and an unreasonable requirement, handed to honest engineers on a timetable that would not wait, produced a Frankenstein, an engine stitched together from a sound old principle and a lorry's bloodline, and a decade of desperate modification, and sent to war before it was ready. The Chieftain deserved better. It deserved the plain, conventional Rolls-Royce diesel it was so very nearly given at the start, and that its own successor would finally receive. Instead, it spent its whole service life hauling, quite literally, the dead weight of a policy across Germany, an idea that had sounded like common sense in a conference room in 1957, and turned into white smoke and black oil and stranded tanks in every year that followed. A few of them survive now, cold and still, in the museums. There is one at Bovington, in the Great Tank Museum, where the curators speak frankly of the notorious L60 as the Chieftain's one great weakness. Stand in front of it, and you are looking at two things at once: the best gun and armor combination of the entire Cold War, and the engine that very nearly threw it all away, and only stopped throwing it away at the very end, when the tank was going home and the works were closing, and it no longer mattered at all. The gun was always going to be remembered. The turret was always going to be remembered. But the truer memorial is the engine. Silent now, its 12 strange pistons stopped at last, because the engine is where the whole story lives for anyone willing to stand in the quiet and work it out.